Once we've made our project, we can get to work making our game in Unity. The main windows we're going to use are the hierarchy, the scene, game, inspector, and project. There'll be others that pop up along the way, such as animation or animators for Mechanim. The scene view navigation is much like Autodesk Maya. Holding Alt and clicking and dragging the left mouse button tumbles the view. Alt and the mouse wheel pans, and Alt and the right mouse dollies in and out. Alternately, scrolling the mouse wheel in and out also dollies. We can switch this view back and forth from a perspective to a drawn isometric, and also from an elevation perspective to a drawn orthographic view. Clicking on the viewport label perspective changes over to an ISO. Clicking on ISO changes back to a perspective. Selecting any one of the axes in the scene takes that view over to a drawn perspective elevation. We're seeing things in a right view, but the perspective lines recede into the distance. Clicking on the right viewport label switches that view over to a drawn, flat orthographic view. Clicking on right again changes back to the perspective, and Alt and the left mouse tumbles again, and we're back to our perspective view. It's very easy to navigate around and position things exactly where we need. Unity's default units are in meters, and so when we bring things in, we need to make sure we're working in real-world scale in meters. At the moment, our scene has, well, exactly nothing in it. I'll bring an object in and see how it looks in the hierarchy and the inspector. In my project window, I can see I'm in the Assets folder which Unity created for me, and in those assets are a folder called Standard Assets. In Standard Assets, I have my character controllers and scripts. These are the packages I had chosen when I created that project. Clicking on the Character Controllers folder shows me the controllers and their sources that are available. There's a standard first-person controller, which looks like a capsule, and a third-person, which starts out as a constructor. I'll take the first-person controller and drag it into the scene. By doing this, I can place it arbitrarily wherever I'd like. And with that object selected, the inspector shows the different properties and components of that first-person controller. I'll press Delete to delete it, and then I'll drag the first-person controller into the hierarchy. Dragging an object into the hierarchy creates that object in the scene at exactly the place it was created originally. For the first-person controller, this is not as important, as we may want to position that first-person controller at a spawn point in our game. However, when we bring in objects from Maya, for example, they'll have their own coordinates in Maya, which will transfer over here to Unity. So if we want things placed exactly as we had placed them in Maya, for example, we can drag them straight from the assets into the hierarchy view, and they'll place correctly in the scene. Within this hierarchy, we can see that the first-person controller has an arrow next to it. Twirling open that arrow shows the two components that are part of the first-person controller. The graphics. Selecting it shows the properties of that particular capsule. Pressing F to focus in zooms in that view. This is actually the object of that first-person controller, what actually collides with a collider or a mesh. The main camera, then, is how that first-person controller sees. And we can see in the inspector that this has not only the properties of a camera, such as the rendering path, clipping planes, and so on, but has some additional components that have been added. There's a GUI layer, or graphical user interface, which will overlay on that main camera. There's a mouse look script that's part of that controller, and this controls how this object looks around to follow the mouse in the game. Selecting the first-person controller again shows other scripts that have been attached. There's our mouse look and also our character motor. This controls, for example, things like movement, jumping, moving platforms, and sliding. And there's even a first-person controller input script. Selecting any object then in the hierarchy or in the game shows it in the inspector and allows us to edit its properties. Selecting any object down here in the project view, such as our first person, again shows those properties. The relationship between the hierarchy and the project window is shown by the color of the text in the hierarchy. The blue text for first-person controller, graphics, and main camera denotes that it is a prefab. A prefab in Unity is a very important concept. What prefabs let us do is define an object once and instance it in the scene. All the instances then reference the original, so changing one changes them all. The text in blue shows that that prefab connection to the first-person controller in the assets is active and working correctly. If this text is red, it means that prefab link has been broken. The main camera here is a standalone. This is our main camera we're seeing our scene with. We can't actually see it because we're in it, but it's not a prefab. It's not related to anything in our assets, for example. Now that I've brought in a first-person controller in my blank scene, I can save that scene, choosing File and Save Scene. Unity scenes have a .unity extension. This is different from a Unity project, which is really just a directory structure. This scene wants to save by default in the Assets folder. We may end up, depending on the complexity of our game, making a Scenes folder. For now, though, I'll save this scene in my Assets folder and get started on bringing things into my game.